Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Voices from the Mausoleum, and welcome back to another Christmas episode of Spooky Sunday Stories. There's only 4 Sundays in the month of December, so I am going to have to put 2 of these together in order to get them all in for the month, which is fine. So in today's episode, I'm going to be reading 2 different things. Christmas horror is so much fun. I'm loving it. If you didn't watch the other episode, go back and do that because that was a really fun story and you don't want to miss it. So without further ado, this is Charity, a modern day Christmas carol by Catherine McCarthy. You better watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Satan Claus is coming to town. Ackles Advertising Agency, England, November 2012. Gotta be in the boardroom at 8 a.m. sharp, Troy. New boss has called a meeting. Yeah, I heard James message me last night. Dan clapped his hands annoyingly close to Troy's ears. Come on then, get a move on. Don't want to be late. Here she's a stickler for timekeeping. Yeah, stickler for a lot of things by all accounts. A right bitch, according to James. True, mate, but we mustn't moan. I thought I'd be out of a job by Christmas, so I don't care what she's like as long as she keeps the place afloat. They reckon she saved her last place from going down the Swanee. Suppose so. Troy did not sound convinced. Have to pay the rent, don't we? Though, to be honest with you, Dan, I'm applying for jobs elsewhere. I mean, just because she saved one place from going down doesn't mean she can do it again. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Allison Jackman breezed into the boardroom, figure-hugging skirt suit, tan legs, and killer heels. The greeting was amiable enough, though neither a hint of smile nor a flicker of warmth accompanied the words. With eagle eyes, she scanned the row of staff who stood to attention as she entered. A French polished finger indicated they could be seated before she embarked on her inauguration speech. Okay, I'm not going to beat around the bush. My name's Allison Jackman. I won't pretend to be something I'm not. In fact, I would prefer to be honest with you from day one. A pause for breath. You're either in it for the long haul or you can leave now. She pointed towards the door and waited. When no one moved, she continued, this business is on its knees. I won't share the exact figures with you. I'll reserve that little pleasure for the finance committee. But believe me when I say we're in the red by a substantial amount, and without a drastic action, each and every one of you will be out of work by the new year. Her eagle-eyed gaze met 2 rows of lowered heads. So we must work hard and be prepared to make what some of you might consider pretty tough decisions if this place is to have any hope of rising from the proverbial ashes. She flashed a tooth-whitened smile in the direction of Roy McInnes, financial director. I'm sure some of you will have been informed that my methods can be pretty ruthless, but times are tough. As I've said, it's fight or flight, I'm afraid. So if anyone feels inclined to hand in their resignation after reading their new job description, please feel free to do so. There's plenty more fish in the sea. This last sentence, delivered with a contemptuous sniff, caused Troy's hackles to rise. The room remained silent. All assembled fixed their gaze on an inanimate object that happened to be within their line of sight. Fucking recession, Troy muttered as soon as he considered them out of earshot. He pitied the members of the finance committee who remained seated in the throes of what could only be termed a dressing down. Through the glazed wall, he observed their pale faces. They look as if they've shit themselves, Dan. Got us by the balls, hasn't she? Not easy to find a job these days, especially if you're from a failed business. During morning break, the staff room remained eerily empty. Most staff members skipped break, afraid of getting pulled into a derogatory conversation about the new boss. Others slipped away in search of a private space in which they could peruse the new job description that had been handed to them at the end of the meeting. Help for the Homeless Shelter, Hove 8th, December 2012. Joe Prenderson, manager of the charitable establishment, was aghast at the letter he had just received. Why, the stingy, low-down bastards, he muttered, despite the fact that no one else was present. Leaping from his seat, he went in search of Brenda Collins, his receptionist, cook, and general lifesaver, who was about to pour a cup of tea in a tiny soup kitchen in the back of the building. She registered the look of shock on his face before he spoke. What's the matter, Joe? You look as though you're about to pass out. Beads of sweat glistened on his top lip. Waving the sheet of white paper in front of her face, he ranted. Of all the mean, low-down stunts to pull, Bryn, this one takes the biscuit. He slumped on a stool, head in his hands. What's happened? For Christ's sake, tell me. Joe stabbed at the sheet of paper. 15 years they've donated to the Christmas fund. 15 years without a miss. And now they've pulled the rug from under our feet. What are you talking about, Joe? You're not making any sense. A sobbing sigh accompanied his next word. We've had a letter, Brenda. Look. Hand trembling, he passed over the offensive document from Ackles' agency. You know, the grand they gave us every year to fund the Christmas dinner? Well, they've gone and pulled out on us 2 weeks before Christmas. He paused, watching her face tarnishin as she devoured the contents of the unsavory letter. I thought something was up. They usually send the check by the end of November at the latest, but I didn't like to give them a ring. Seemed a bit cheeky like. I can't believe they've left it so late to tell us. He shook his head. I'm gutted. We haven't even got time to whip up a fundraise now. What do we do, Bryn? Tears of frustration plopped into the letter as Brenda read, Oh my God, Joe. What are we going to do? Without their donation, there will be no Christmas dinner. They must know we count on it. I can't believe they've done this. She plunked on the stool opposite before her legs gave way. Surely they must realize how desperate this place is at Christmas. I mean, we've always shown gratitude, haven't we, Joe? We've never taken it for granted. What the hell are we going to do? Canteen, help for the homeless, same day. Joe and Brenda fed the regulars as usual, all while attempting to put on a brave face. It was -3 outside, and many of the clients had come in frozen to the bone. They couldn't bear to give them the bad news, not until they'd been fed and watered. Many of those gathered in a little canteen had been coming to the shelter for several years. Others were more transient, but Joe and Brenda recognized each and every face. Christmas was the most difficult time of year, and the regulars looked forward to the feast and entertainment the shelter provided. Once they finished eating and were gathered in their usual little cliques, Joe spoke up. Excuse me, guys. I need a word. The room fell silent. He cleared his throat and wrung his hands. I'm afraid we've got some bad news today. All eyes turned on him. As most of you know, our funding comes entirely from charity. For many years, the advertising agency down the road has funded the Christmas bash, but today I received a letter from their new chief executive, a certain Miss Allison Jackman, stating that we're pulling the funds this year. He resisted eye contact as he spoke. For several moments, the room remained silent when Charlie Waters, an old veteran of the establishment, piped up. What you saying, Joe? There'll be no Christmas dinner this year? Joe flinched as though wounded. Doesn't look like it, Charlie. Me and Brenda are still in shock. We can't believe they left it till now to tell us. We only found out this morning. Everyone spoke at the same time. The room erupted into a cacophony of dismay. You got any paper I can borrow, Joe? Charlie asked when things had calmed down a bit. I'm not going to let them get away with this. Least I can do is write a letter explaining how we feel. None of us want to beg. We all wish we didn't have to rely on charity. But the mean sods shouldn't be allowed to get away with this, especially as they're so late in telling us. Charlie shuffled off behind Joe towards the office to fetch pen and paper. If you want any help with that letter, Charlie, let me know, Joe said. The despondency in Charlie's cataract-clouded eyes caused his heart to sink further. No thanks, Joe. I'll write it myself if you don't mind. I'm not the best speller in the world, but I think I can make myself understood. That way, I can say exactly what I think. Of course, Charlie. I guess it's better coming from you. After all, you're the poor sods whose Christmas will be ruined. Retreating into an empty corner of the canteen, Charlie sat and penned the letter. Christmas Eve 2012, Allison Jackman's house, Brighton. At precisely 11:45 p.m., Allison turned the key and entered the capacious hallway of her Victorian semi. Whisking the security chain across, she slipped out of her pale gray Max Mara coat and slung it over the banister. Entering the living room, she flicked on the light before kicking off her 6-inch high Louboutins and padding barefoot across the plush cream carpet. Her face was a thunderstorm. Who the fuck does he think he is, she muttered, still annoyed that the little tosser Dan had actually had the audacity to hit on her. Okay, so he had downed a good few whiskeys, but that didn't give him the right to lay a finger on her. How fucking dare he? She shuddered as she recalled the warmth of his fingers tracing the length of her spine. She had turned around only to come face to face with him. A cloud of bourbon-laced breath wafted as he slurred. You gonna be lonely tonight, darling? She had wanted to slap his face, but knew it would have caused a scene. Many would have enjoyed her lashing out, so she hadn't granted them the pleasure. They'd worked until 7 o'clock as usual. She had no intention of letting them out early just because it was bloody Christmas Eve, not with the place in such an appalling mess. Why should she? No, they'd have to prove themselves worthy before she'd be prepared to slacken the reins. Too bloody soft the old boss had been, and that was why the business was in such a state. She'd begrudgingly gone along to the bar just to show her face, intending to be home by 9:30, but one G&T led to another, and before she knew it, it had gone 11. Then that slime ball had touched her up and ruined her evening. I'll have him out by March, she promised herself through gritted teeth. Allison stumbled to the bathroom, head spinning. The 5 G&Ts were taking their toll. She stripped, leaving her black dress strewn on the floor. before jumping into the shower. Slipping into a pair of midnight blue silk pajamas, she padded barefoot back to the living room. She poured another G&T, lit a few candles, and flopped down on the sofa. The room seemed eerily quiet, so locating the remote for the Bluetooth, she scrolled through her playlist before selecting Amy Winehouse. No fucking Christmas music for her. What a load of trite nonsense that was. Feet up, she tried to focus on the lyrics in an attempt to divert her thoughts. However, the task of having to visit her mother in the nursing home the following morning refused to shift. Could she get away with a phone call instead? Perhaps she would lie and say she had the flu. A groan of annoyance as she remembered she couldn't very well do that, as she'd arranged to go straight from the nursing home to her sister and brother-in-law's for lunch. Perhaps she'd cancel that as well. After all, a traditional family Christmas lunch was not her idea of fun. Truth be told, she'd prefer to spend the day alone, eating and drinking and watching whatever she wanted on TV, rather than have to endure someone else's inane choice, or worse still, some shitty party game. Perhaps she would cancel. She'd make her mind up in the morning. Closing her eyes, she inhaled the subtle scent of midnight jasmine. The chorus of Back to Black lulled her into a trance. She sang along, glass in hand, slurring a little. A rustle from the fireplace made her bolt upright. Nothing. Just the wind loosening some soot in the chimney. The track switched to I'm No Good. Eyes closed, she grinned, reveling in the lyrics message, indulging herself for a few moments in the memory of Robin, the sycophantic leech, who was now well and truly her ex. Without warning, an intense heat engulfed her. She sensed the presence in the room before she opened her eyes. It took less than a second for her half-drunk brain to register the demonic red-clad being that loomed over her. It gazed at her greedily, a ruthless grin splitting its face from ear to ear before its claws tore into her flesh. No time to fight back, her torso ripped from navel to breastbone in one fell swoop. Midnight silk soaked crimson and dripped onto the beige leather. Not even time to scream. Christmas Day, 4 p.m., 2012. When Allison failed to show for lunch as arranged and countless attempts to reach her mobile went unanswered, her sister phoned the police. She met them at Allison's front door but had no key. Allison didn't trust anyone enough to give them a spare. Having broken down the door, the two officers crossed the hall and entered the living room, from where the sickly sweet smell of blood was traceable to an accustomed nose. There, sprawled at a contorted angle on the sofa, lay Allison's body, or what remained of it. On an Having broken down the door, the two officers crossed the hall and entered the living room, from which the sickly sweet smell of blood was traceable to an accustomed nose. There, sprawled at a contorted angle on the sofa, lay Allison's body, or what remained of it. On exposed ribs, a bloody note lay in wait. Dear Santa Claus, I would like to tell you what has just happened to our Christmas dinner. This woman called Allison Jackman, who is the new boss of Ackle Adverts and Hove, has stopped the money they always send to our homeless charity. This means we will have no Christmas dinner this year. We are gutted. We know you always help whoever's in need at Christmas. Can you help us, Satan? Thanks, Charlie Waters. They never did find the culprit. I'm going to put a picture of the letter, like right here, so you can see how it's written, just so you get the full effect of what actually happened. When he tried to write Santa Claus a note, he actually summoned a demon. Yeah, so that's Charity, a modern day Christmas Carol by Catherine McCarthy. It's totally the same recording and the same day. So what I'm going to be reading as the second half of this episode is actually a chapter from a book called The Feast of the Innocents by Colin Harker. So what they did was they sent me a couple of chapters that were more Christmas in nature. Because again, this is not a short, this is from a full-length novel. And as always, all of that information will be in the description, so you can go check it out. They actually did send me some context, but I kind of decided that I'm not going to give you context, because the whole point of doing these is to make you want to go check out these authors and read their books and their stories and find them on socials and go support them. I'm a big fan of supporting indie, so anything I can do to help promote indie work, whether it's indie filmmaking, indie authors, indie artists, anything that falls under the indie umbrella, I'm going to do. So I think I'm going to not give you context. and I'm going to just read it. And hopefully it will raise enough question to make you want to go check out the book yourself. Especially because, I mean, there really is like, and I've said this already, probably multiple times by now, but like one of my favorite things about this time of year is Christmas horror. Like there really just isn't anything like it. And so you should want to read this anyway. So here we go. So again, this is going to be chapter 25. There is a little bit of a note in here. I am going to read that, but I'm not going to read the paragraph of context because like I said, I want my chair keeps, I need a rug. I want you to be confused enough and engaged enough that you want to go check this out. So again, this is going to be chapter 25 from The Feast of the Innocents by Colin Harker. The short little thing under the chapter 25 says, in which the priory readies itself for the coming of Christmas, the annual hunt, and the presentation of a mystery play by Mr. Chapman, followed by a tragedy of anonymous origin. That's all you're getting out of me. All right, so chapter 25 from The Feast of the Innocents by Colin Harker. If the snows came late to that area of Scotland in the winter of 1665, then when they at last fell upon that frosty December midnight, they fell with all the force of a thwarted power that will no longer be kept at bay. They fell as the waysailor slept beneath the roof of the priory, as Cyrus lay awake contemplating with a mixture of fear and bewilderment the last word spoken to him by the chimney sweeper, and as Childermas himself placed the tip of a torturing device between his lips. They set their dominion over the moors, the forests, the gambrel roofs of Hounswick, and the battlements of Laughlin Priory, heaping the skeleton branches with banks of frost and muffling the silent graves of the newly dead beneath their immutable white. Travelers fancied that they saw, rising above the trees at some distance from the priory, the thin wisp of smoke, and thought of the legends that they had heard of the witch Alison Mackenzie and her murderous sons. But such tales are a comfort only to those who have a hearthside to warm them against the inevitable chill of dread that follows such storytelling. The traders and wayfarers who by custom followed the road from Shrewsville to Hounswick recalled too the stories of murdered young men, and thus kept their distance from both Hounswick and the immense Greystone Priory that seemed to preside over these happenings. Though few guests were expected at the priory, the next several days were still spent in a flurry of preparation, not only for the religious festivities of the Advent season and the Feast of the Holy Innocents, but also for the annual hunt. Dagworth's fingers grew numb from the bitter northerly wind as he spent hours upon the moors with his curs, keeping them in practice for the scouting of quail, pheasant, rabbit, and fox. Feversham garlanded the doorpost and walls with branches of pine and fir, crosses of beaten gold and silver, and candles of colored wax, while Childermas divided his time between stirring the coals of every hearth in the priory and keeping a ministering eye upon the worshipful company of grocers, whose charge he had been given. For Reverend Abeline, understanding the chimney sweeper's temperament, had judged all this occupation would keep him sufficiently distracted from his odious custom of spying upon his superiors, satisfying that obscure love of mastery that Abeline had sensed in Childermas's soul. The chaplain was correct in a very limited fashion, as it did give Childermas no small amount of pleasure to lord it over the waysailers in his cold and passionless way, but unbeknownst to Abeline, he also slacked his other, more heated compulsion. In the shadows of the library, wherein he had begun to read the chronicles of Lord Stephen Gosselin, who had reigned as the master of the priory during the early reign of Charles, curiosity had driven him into the lower vaults of the priory's library, just as it had compelled him to steal into the library of Cyrus and make himself master of a history that was not his own. Ignorant of his own past, up until the point when he had begun as a young child to work as a chimney sweeper in Hounswick, he was a veritable reader for every narrative other than his own. Their faults and their virtues were the weapons which could restore or wound according to Childermas's pleasure, whilst those whose hearts he could read could do nothing to touch him, for his history, like that of a beast or an angel, was all a blank. His was all the advantage, while the world and its denizens, titled or otherwise, remained defenseless against his single penetrating eye. So it had been for years, yet it was Childermas's hope that the time was approaching when he would do more than merely watch. Gaily whistling in dulce jubilo beneath his breath in time to the piping of one of the grocers, Childermas compassed on several long strides the immense arena-like chamber in which the waysailers had been placed. His movements were swift and sinuous, and what he lacked in regality, he made up for in a peculiarly boneless, fluid grace. He had exchanged his stained and ragged garments for the fresh coat and doublet, both of the same black hue that the chaplain had grudgingly offered him, and instead of his usual sooty broom, the chimney sweeper now held a straight cane of ebony oak in which was sheathed a thin blade that could be drawn out with a twist of its end. This deadly ornament he pivoted and swung with a pendulum-like precision in time to his measured walk and song, until he paused at last before Shipwash, who was witnessing a rehearsal of Mr. Chapman's "O the Nativity of the Christ Child," with an expression that was less than commendatory. "They can certainly keep a tune, though, can't they, Master Shipwash?" Childermass remarked. The grocer started violently and exclaimed, "Good God, lad, can't you stomp about a bit more," approaching a man from behind. "This creeping habit of yours has subtracted several years from my life already." Shipwash had not been so easily startled before, but the death of Nat had altered much of his former nature. That, and the fact that, for all his generosity, there was something in the pale-eyed chimney sweeper's presence that unaccountably repulsed him. "Forgive me, sir," Childermass returned, with that humorless smile of his that seemed somehow to lower the corners of his thin, bloodless lips rather than raise them. He would have disliked Shipwash intensely for his hostile attitude had they been equals, on account of the chimney sweeper's authority over the waysailers. However, Childermass merely regarded him with indifference. "I was only remarking on the progress of your company." "Progress?" Shipwash snorted. In spite of his aversion for Childermass, he did not mind gossiping freely with him. The young man, for all his peculiar ways, at least had good ears. "If you term this progress, Master Childermass, then you are either generous or a fool. Were little Nat still with us, we would at least possess a tolerable enough choir. As it is, his death has left us nothing." The grocer's eyes grew bright with tears, and Childermass averted his gaze. When his mysterious hints happened to inflict pain or terror, then the chimney sweeper's living eye would be trained with a curious gloating upon his victim. Grief, however, seemed to baffle and subdue him. Shipwash, for his part, took his aversion as a further sign of the callous soul that lay behind that pale eye. "As it happens," Childermass at least said. "As it happens," Childermass at last said, "I came to inform you, sir, that the child's funeral is to be held tomorrow morning. Tonight, as you know, is the third and last night of his wake." "Who will watch him?" Shipwash asked. He knew that Feversham and Dagworth had remained by the side of the coffin upon the first and second nights. "I shall," Childermass replied. Shipwash looked at the chimney sweeper with an expression of surprise and scorn. "You?" He shook his head, sorrow paling his face once again. "You shall not play cards over his poor little body, will you?" "I shall do as I have been instructed, sir," Childermass replied. "I shall watch over him." "You priory folk here are all very good at watching dead children," said Shipwash. "I wish that you lot were more clever at catching their killers." Childermass looked at him and said nothing. In truth, the chimney sweeper was closer than most to comprehending the mystery behind the horror, but even he possessed only the vaguest of hints and visions, enough to whet its curiosity, but not enough for him to prevent further horror. These secrets he had kept to himself, turning them over and over in his mind whilst Withing had been away to Oxford. Now the young lord had returned to the priory, and with him a friend who brought at his heels a new peril. A killer who left the limbs of his victims scattered in treetops, and a French nobleman with a taste for blood, both now converged at once upon the priory. But Childermass had them in his heart. None else knew the priory as the chimney sweeper did, and it was impossible for any force to encroach upon it without his own soul feeling the violation as well. He had already exceeded his authority by informing all servants that there was a villain abroad in the land, and that they should admit no stranger within the priory's walls without his personal consent, warning that those who kept their doors and windows carelessly unlocked were inviting a murderer into their midst. Torturing and subtle though he could be, the ties that bound Childermass to the priory were made for cords that could bind and compel him to the performances of heroics and villainies alike. To him, they were all a similar cast, so long as they served his turn. "What are you smiling at?" Shipwash inquired abruptly. Childermass gave a brief shudder, as though divorcing himself for the moment from a thought both pleasurable and somewhat terrifying. He then extracted a sheaf of papers and put them into Shipwash's hand. "When you tire of watching your men rehearse Master Chaplin's heroic couplets," the chimney sweeper replied, "then read this and tell me what you think of it. I should like you and your children perform this upon Christmas Eve." "That allows us little time for preparation, Master Childermass," Shipwash said, his brow furrowing. "Enough time, I assure you." "What sort of piece is it, and who is its maker?" "'Tis a tragedy with comic elements, or a comedy with scenes of tragedy in its midst. A tragicomedy, if you will, sir. It's called The Orchard and the Lamb. And its author? Shipwash persisted. Myself, but you will announce it as written by the Cavalier Christophe des Saints Innocents. I pray that you do this thing for me. It shall be worth your while, I assure you. As he spoke, he produced the jeweled torturer's instrument that he had showed Clarice the night before. Its precious stones twinkled luminously in the candlelight. For a moment, Shipwash was tempted. He took the device in his hand and turned it over, unable to determine what its use was, but certain of the high price that it would fetch. Then, abruptly, he returned it to Childermass with a gruff shake of his head. Keep your little trinket, Master Childermass, he returned. I'll not be bought with baubles. Then you will not perform my play? I will. But I must warn you straight off, young man, that I don't like the look of you, and that the only reason that I am willing to do this without recompense is simply because I'm reluctant to accept any payment from you. How can I be certain that it is not stolen? Childermass laughed then. It was not the hellish laughter that made Feversham wish to stop his ears, but an unexpected mirth that caused his pale eyes to twinkle and his thin cheeks to take on a rare intimation of color. Thank you, sir. I wish that I could pay you properly, but you see, they give me nothing more than my lodging and keep in return for my services. Then I only have one request, Shipwash replied. I notice that you have this one fellow in your dramatis persona called the Visconte Cavalcanti, the one you call your villain hero, but I have only old men and children in my company. I therefore request that you play your protagonist in our performance. Childermash hesitated, and his eye grew subtle as though he was considering the wisdom of such an action. At last he gave a slight nod. If you wish it, then I shall, sir, though I must warn you that I have no experience in the art of mimicry at all. Sir, Shipwash said with a heavy sigh, if you but say half your lines and look at your fellow player instead of the audience during the performance, then you shall already be the Richard Burbage of our troupe. Of course, Shipwash little suspected that the drama he held in his hand was more a torturer's love thing than the device that Childermass kept in his pocket, nor did the circumspect Childermass realize that his decision to act the part of thespian in his own tragedy would put him in greater danger than he had ever known. Alas, for the lot of man, even the subtlest machinations are at the mercy of forces that he cannot see, and the invisible worlds of spirit and of mortal craft, and may affect the plots of both the lowly and the great alike, be he an exiled marquis, a Puritan lad, a sweeper of chimneys, or a Shrewsfield grocer. That is chapter 25 from The Feast of the Innocents. Let me just say, I love the way this is written. Don't get me wrong. There's probably more cuts than I would like in this, because when I read things in my head, it's a lot easier to get through a flow of words that are not what I'm used to reading or what I'm, what not expecting. But this is beautifully written. I'm like, yeah. I'm really curious about the rest of the story, which I think is good. I'm glad I didn't give context, because even though we don't know like any of the stuff leading up to this, I think it's good, because I think this is like, there's some things going on and you're like, okay, but like, what does that mean? And what is this thing? And who is this? And I think that that's perfect, because that means that you should want to go check out this book. So anyway, that was chapter 25 from The Feast of the Innocents by Colin Harker. Again, I will put Catherine and Colin's information in the description for this episode. And yeah, that's all I have for this one. Next Sunday, I'll be reading another one, and yeah, lots more Christmas themed horror things coming your way. So hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week coming up, and I will see you in the next one.